The elevator chime on the 45th floor of the Millennium Tower didn't just sound like a bell, it sounded like money. When the polished steel doors slid open, they revealed a world that smelled of Italian leather, fresh espresso, and fear. This was the domain of Gregor Sterling. As the interim CEO of OmniCorp, Sterling walked through the hallways as if he owned the very oxygen the employees were breathing. He checked his reflection in the glass wall of the conference room, adjusting a tie that cost more than a Honda Civic. Today was the day. Today, the board would vote on the merger that would dismantle the company's charitable arm, gut the employee pension fund, and deposit a $20 million bonus directly into Sterling's offshore account. He had the votes. He had the influence. He had the arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He didn't notice the girl sitting on the low bench near the reception desk. Or rather, he saw her, but his brain registered her as furniture. Or worse, as a stain. She was 12 years old, wearing a faded denim jacket with a patch on the elbow and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a practical, messy bun, and she was clutching a battered leather folder to her chest like a shield. Her name was Maya, and in this cathedral of capitalism, she looked about as out of place as a dandelion growing in a bank vault. Sterling breezed past the reception, barking orders at his assistant about coffee temperatures and stock prices when he stopped. He turned on his heel, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the girl. She was kicking her feet nervously, staring at the closed double doors of the boardroom. To Sterling, her presence was an aesthetic offense. It ruined the perfect, sterile image of power he was trying to project for the incoming investors. He walked over to her, his shadow looming large over her small frame. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask if she needed help. He simply assumed. He saw the skin color, he saw the old clothes, and he did the math with his prejudice calculator. He snapped his fingers in front of her face to get her attention. When Maya looked up, her eyes wide and intelligent, he didn't see a person. He saw a nuisance. He told her that the service elevator was around the corner. He told her that if she was waiting for her mother to finish mopping the floors, she needed to wait in the basement, not in the executive lobby. He spoke slowly, enunciating every word as if she wouldn't understand English, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far worse than shouting. He pointed a manicured finger toward the freight elevators and told her to scoot. Maya stood up. She didn't scurry away. She didn't apologize. She stood her ground, clutching that old leather folder tighter. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice quiet but steady, trying to explain that she was here for the meeting, that she was supposed to be inside. But Sterling cut her off with a laugh that sounded like dry leaves being crushed. He looked around at the other executives gathering in the hall, inviting them to share the joke. He mocked her, asking if she was the new financial consultant from the playground. He told her that grown-ups were about to discuss billions of dollars, and this wasn't a place for little girls to play pretend office. He leaned in close, his cologne overpowering, and whispered that if security had to come up here, her mother would lose her cleaning job before lunchtime. The threat hung in the air. Maya bit her lip. She knew who this man was. She knew everything about him. She knew he had cut the healthcare benefits for the company's lowest-paid workers last month. She knew he wanted to sell off her father's legacy for parts. But she also knew the rules of this building better than he did. She took a step toward the boardroom doors. Sterling physically blocked her path. He wasn't playing anymore. His face flushed red. He grabbed her shoulder, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to push her back toward the bench. He told her to sit down and shut up, or he'd have her thrown out on the street. Then, he turned his back on her, adjusted his cufflinks, and marched into the boardroom, followed by a stream of suits who wouldn't make eye contact with the child they were leaving behind. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the lobby. Maya was alone again. She sat back down on the bench. She didn't cry. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. She clicked it open. Inside was a picture of a smiling man with kind eyes. Her father, Marcus King, the founder of OmniCorp, who had passed away 6 months ago. He had started this company in a garage with nothing but a dream to make affordable medicine. He had built it into an empire, and he had warned her about men like Sterling. He had told her that people would underestimate her because of her age, her gender, and her race. He had told her that silence was sometimes the loudest weapon in the room. So she waited. Inside the boardroom, the air conditioning was set to a crisp 68 degrees. The room was soundproofed, insulated from the world outside. 12 people sat around a table made of wood from a rainforest that probably no longer existed. At the head of the table sat Sterling. He looked like a king holding court. He opened his laptop, spread his papers, and tapped the microphone. He was ready to pave over the past and cement his future. He called the meeting to order, his voice booming with authority. He announced that the first order of business was the immediate ratification of the merger. He looked around the table, expecting nodding heads and raised hands. But nobody moved. At the far end of the table, the company's chief legal counsel, an elderly man named Arthur Penhaligon, cleared his throat. Arthur had been with the company since the garage days. He wore a suit that was 10 years out of style and carried a briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at the empty chair to Sterling's right. The leather chair was oversized, imposing, and conspicuously vacant. Arthur quietly stated that they could not proceed. Sterling blinked. He asked what the problem was. He had the proxy votes. He had the board's approval. He wanted this done before lunch. Arthur adjusted his glasses and tapped a thick document in front of him. He explained that according to the company bylaws written by the late Marcus King himself, any vote involving the sale or merger of the company assets required a unanimous quorum of all major shareholders. Sterling waved his hand dismissively. He said every major shareholder was present. He listed them off: the hedge fund guys, the bank representatives, the internal board. Everyone was there. Arthur shook his head. He pointed to the empty chair again. He reminded Sterling that the King Family Trust held a 51% controlling interest in OmniCorp. Without the representative of that trust present and voting, the meeting was legally void. Nothing could be signed. Nothing could be sold. The merger was dead in the water until that chair was filled. Sterling let out a frustrated groan. He checked his Rolex. He assumed the representative was some high-priced lawyer from New York or a banker from Zurich who was running late because of traffic. He demanded to know where this person was. He ranted about professionalism and how time was money. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling, looking for an email or a text, anything to explain the delay. He asked Arthur who they were waiting for. Arthur simply said, "The chairwoman is on the premises. She arrived 20 minutes ago." Sterling's patience snapped. If the VIP was in the building, why weren't they in the room? He imagined some prima donna billionaire making them wait just to assert dominance. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He told the board to sit tight. He said he would go out and personally escort this chairwoman into the room, and he would make sure she understood that his time was not to be wasted. He marched to the double doors, threw them open, and stormed back out into the lobby. The lobby was exactly as he had left it. Empty, silent, except for the receptionist typing quietly at her desk, and the little girl in the denim jacket sitting on the bench. Sterling looked left. He looked right. He expected to see a woman in a Chanel suit or an entourage of assistants. He saw no one. He spun around, scanning the hallway. Nothing. The only person there was the janitor's kid, still clutching her battered folder, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear anymore. It was patience. Sterling's blood pressure spiked. He marched over to the receptionist. He demanded to know if a VIP guest had arrived. The receptionist looked confused. She checked her log. She said no one had come up except the board members and the child. Sterling rubbed his temples. He felt like he was losing his mind. He turned back to Maya. She was the only variable that didn't fit. His anger found a target. He stormed over to the bench, towering over her again. He shouted at her. He asked her if she had seen a woman come through here. A woman in a suit. Someone important. Maya just shook her head slowly. Sterling lost it. He screamed that she was useless, that she shouldn't even be here, and that she was cluttering up the waiting area. He grabbed his phone to call security, determined to remove her physically this time. He was dialing the number when the boardroom doors opened behind him. Arthur Penhaligon stepped out. The old lawyer walked with a slow, deliberate gait. He didn't look at Sterling. He walked straight past the furious CEO and approached the bench. Sterling watched, confused, phone halfway to his ear. He saw Arthur stop in front of the girl in the dirty sneakers. He saw the old lawyer bow his head respectfully, a gesture of deference he had never shown to Sterling. "Madam Chairwoman," Arthur said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent lobby. "The board is ready for you. We apologize for the delay." Sterling froze. The phone slipped from his fingers and hit the marble floor with a loud crack. He watched as the girl stood up. She didn't look like a janitor's kid anymore. She stood tall, her spine straight, radiating a quiet dignity that suddenly made Sterling feel very small. She handed Arthur the battered leather folder. Arthur took it like it was a sacred text. Maya looked at Sterling. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at him with the same level, analytical gaze her father used to have before he acquired a competitor. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and articulate, devoid of the fear he had projected onto her earlier. "I believe you told me the service elevator was in the basement. I hope you know the way, because after this meeting, you're going to need it." She walked past him. She didn't even brush his shoulder. She walked toward the boardroom doors that he had slammed in her face 20 minutes ago. Arthur held the door open for her. As she passed the threshold, the entire board of directors, the billionaires, the bankers, the sharks, stood up in unison. They weren't standing for Sterling. They were standing for her. The door didn't close immediately. It stayed open just long enough for Sterling to see Maya take the seat at the head of the table. The empty chair, the big leather one. She sat in it, and despite her size, she filled it completely. She placed her hands on the mahogany table, intertwined her fingers, and looked down the long row of stunned faces. Sterling was left standing in the hallway, the echo of his own insults still ringing in his ears. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized, with a sickening lurch of his stomach, that he hadn't just insulted a child. He had assaulted the majority shareholder. He had tried to throw the owner of the company out of her own building. He walked slowly toward the door, his legs feeling like lead. He had to go in there. He had to face her. But for the first time in his career, Gregor Sterling was terrified. Inside, the meeting had officially begun. Maya didn't waste time. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She opened the battered folder. Inside were not drawings or homework, but legal documents, notarized trust deeds, and a proxy statement signed by her father on his deathbed, transferring all voting rights to his daughter, Maya King, effective immediately upon his passing. She looked at the agenda on the table, the merger that Sterling had orchestrated. She picked up the document. "This proposal," she said, addressing the room, "is rejected." She tore the paper in half. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the silent room. "My father built this company to help people, not to line the pockets of interim management. Effective immediately, the merger is off the table." She turned her gaze to the door, where Sterling was now hovering, pale and sweating. "And regarding the position of CEO, I believe we have a vacancy." The room remained silent, but the shift in power was palpable. It wasn't just about the shares. It was about the presence. Maya possessed something Sterling never had: legitimacy. She spoke of the workers, the researchers, the janitorial staff, the people Sterling had called trash. She reminded the board that without those people, there was no company. She spoke about the woman who mopped the floors of the lobby, the one Sterling had used as an insult. That woman, Maya said, has worked here for 15 years. She put 2 kids through college. She has more integrity in her little finger than the man standing in the doorway has in his entire expensive suit. Sterling tried to speak. He tried to muster some of his usual bluster, to spin this, to claim it was a misunderstanding. "Miss King," he stammered, stepping into the room. I didn't know. If I had known who you were." That Maya cut him off. "Is exactly the problem, Mr. Sterling. You treated me like garbage because you thought I was nobody. You thought I was poor. You thought I was weak. You only treat people with respect when you think they have power over you. That is not leadership. That is cowardice." She turned to the board. "I move for the immediate termination of Gregor Sterling as CEO for cause. The cause being conduct detrimental to the company's values and gross incompetence." "Seconded," Arthur said immediately. "All in favor?" Maya asked. Every hand in the room went up. Even Sterling's allies, the men who had laughed at his jokes in the elevator, raised their hands. They were sharks, and they smelled blood in the water. They knew the king was dead. Long live the queen. Sterling stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He had lost everything in the span of 30 minutes. His bonus, his reputation, his power. All because he couldn't be bothered to be kind to a child in a denim jacket. Security was called. Not for Maya. For him. The same guards he had threatened to fire earlier arrived. They didn't look at him with fear anymore. They looked at him with professional indifference. They asked him to hand over his badge. They escorted him out, past the table where a 12-year-old girl was now calmly discussing the quarterly projections with the CFO. As Sterling was led to the elevator, the service elevator, as per protocol for terminated employees, he looked back one last time. He saw Maya. She wasn't looking at him. She was already working. She had saved her father's company. She had saved the employees' pensions. And she had done it without raising her voice, without a tailored suit, and without a Rolex. The narrator pauses here, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This wasn't just a boardroom coup. This was a reckoning. But the story wasn't over. Sterling wasn't the type of man to go quietly. He had secrets. He had leverage. And as the elevator doors closed on his career, he was already planning his revenge. He knew something about the company that even Maya didn't know, a buried secret in the accounting files that could bring the whole empire crashing down, regardless of who sat in the big chair. Maya thought the battle was won. She didn't know the war had just begun. The descent from the 45th floor to the basement took exactly 42 seconds, but for Gregor Sterling, it felt like an eternity in purgatory. The service elevator didn't have the mirrored walls or the hushed, smooth ride of the executive lifts. It rattled. It smelled of industrial-strength cleaner and yesterday's garbage. Sterling stood alone, the silver severance packet clutching in his hand like a dead dove. His reflection in the brushed metal doors was distorted, stretched thin and wide, making him look like a monster in a funhouse mirror. But the monster wasn't scared anymore. The monster was calculating. As the numbers on the display ticked down, 30, 20, 10, Sterling's shock began to harden into a cold, diamond-hard rage. He pulled out his phone. The screen was already lighting up with notifications. The news of the aborted merger had hit the wire. The stock was wobbling. He dialed a number he had saved under damage control. He didn't wait for a greeting. He simply said, "Initiate Protocol 0. Burn the files." and give me an interview with the Financial Times. Tonight, upstairs, the air in the boardroom had shifted from stunned silence to a nervous, buzzing energy. The sharks were still sharks, but they were confused sharks. They had just watched a 12-year-old girl decapitate their leader, and now they were waiting to see if she would feed them or eat them. Maya sat at the head of the table, her legs not quite touching the floor, feeling the immense weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping exhaustion. She looked at the faces around the table. These men had worked with her father for years, yet not one of them had visited him in the hospital. Not one of them had sent a card to the funeral. They were loyal only to the bottom line. Arthur Penhaligon, the old lawyer, placed a hand gently on the table. He broke the silence, suggesting a recess. He told the board that the chairwoman needed to be briefed on the operational status of the company before any further motions could be passed. The board members nodded, eager to get out of the room and check their stock portfolios. They filed out, casting backward glances at the girl in the denim jacket, whispering behind their hands. When the heavy doors finally clicked shut, leaving Maya and Arthur alone in the vast, soundproofed room, Maya let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 6 months. She slumped slightly in the leather chair, suddenly looking very small and very young. She asked Arthur if she had done the right thing. Arthur smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile that reminded her of her grandfather. He told her that her father would have been dancing on the table. But then, his face grew serious. He told her that firing Sterling was the easy part. Surviving him would be the war. The war started 20 minutes later. Maya and Arthur were in her father's old office, a corner suite that Sterling had turned into a shrine to his own ego, filled with modern art and chrome furniture. They were looking for the physical ledgers, the black books her father always kept. That was when a first alert popped up on the oversized monitor on the wall. A breaking news banner. The headline read, "OmniCorp Chaos. Child heiress oust CEO. Stock plummets." The screen cut to a live feed. Sterling was standing on the steps of the building, surrounded by microphones. He didn't look like a fired employee. He looked like a martyr. He had taken off his tie and unbuttoned his collar, looking disheveled and concerned. He was spinning a narrative that was as brilliant as it was poisonous. He told the reporters that he was heartbroken. He said he had tried to protect the company from the erratic whims of a grieving child who had no understanding of complex economics. He claimed that Maya was being manipulated by rogue elements within the company, a veiled jab at Arthur. He looked directly into the camera, his eyes shimmering with fake sincerity, and said that the merger was the only thing keeping the company solvent. He claimed that without it, OmniCorp would be bankrupt within a week. He painted a picture of thousands of employees losing their jobs because a little girl wanted to play boss. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Within minutes, the narrative online shifted. The comments on the live stream turned from support to skepticism. People were asking if a 12-year-old could really run a pharma giant. Investors were panicking. The stock price, which had wobbled earlier, began to freefall. Maya watched the screen, her hands trembling. She felt the walls closing in. She asked Arthur if it was true. Was the company really in trouble? Arthur hesitated. That hesitation terrified her more than Sterling's shouting ever had. Arthur went to a wall safe hidden behind a painting Sterling hadn't bothered to remove because he didn't know the safe existed. Arthur spun the dial. He pulled out a stack of documents that were not digital, not on the server, and definitely not in the files Sterling had tried to burn. These were the shadow ledgers. Arthur spread them out on the desk. He explained that Sterling hadn't just been greedy, he had been gambling. To pump up the stock price and trigger his performance bonuses over the last year, Sterling had been taking out massive, high-interest loans against the company's future assets. He had leveraged the patents, the real estate, even the pension fund. The merger wasn't just a sale, it was a bailout. Sterling had agreed to sell the company for parts to a rival conglomerate just to cover the debts he had accrued. Now that the merger was dead, the debts were due. Arthur pointed to a date on the ledger. Friday, he said, his voice grave. The loans get called in on Friday. That's 48 hours from now. Maya looked at the numbers. They were staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars. If they didn't pay it back, the banks would seize everything. The company would be liquidated. Her father's life work would be auctioned off to the highest bidder, likely the very same rival company Sterling had tried to sell to, but for pennies on the dollar. Sterling had rigged the game so that if he lost, everyone lost. He had strapped a bomb to the hull of the ship, and Maya had just fired the only man who knew the code to disarm it. Or so he wanted them to believe. Maya stood up and walked to the window. The city below looked different now. It didn't look like a kingdom. It looked like a machine that was ready to crush her. She felt a wave of nausea. She was 12. She should be worrying about math homework and whether her friend were going to the mall, not about corporate debt restructuring and hostile takeovers. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, hot and stinging. She whispered that she couldn't do this. She said Sterling was right. She was just a kid. She had ruined everything. Arthur didn't coddle her this time. He didn't offer a hug. He offered her a reality check. He told her that her father started this business in a garage with a leaky roof. He told her that when the FDA rejected their first drug, her father didn't cry. He went back to the lab and worked for 3 days straight without sleep. He told her that being a leader wasn't about knowing everything. It was about knowing what you fight for. He asked her if she was fighting for her ego or for the people. Maya wiped her face. She turned back to the desk. She looked at the ledger, really looked at it. She saw the pattern. Sterling had borrowed against the assets. Yes, but he had hidden the money trails. He hadn't just spent it. He had moved it. Project Ether. The name appeared 3 times in the ledger. She asked Arthur what Project Ether was. Arthur frowned. He said he had never heard of it. It wasn't on the official books. It was a ghost project. Maya's eyes narrowed. She remembered something. Months ago, before her father got sick, he had been excited about something new. He had brought home a prototype, a water filtration system that could remove microplastics and pharmaceutical runoff cheaply. He had called it the Blue Lung. He wanted to give it away to developing nations. Sterling had hated the idea. He said there was no profit in altruism. Maya realized with a jolt that Project Ether wasn't a hole where money vanished. It was a shell company where Sterling was hiding the patent for the Blue Lung. He was stealing the company's most valuable future asset to sell it privately, while leaving the company with the debt. He's stealing the future, Maya whispered. He wants to bankrupt us so he can buy the patent from the wreckage for nothing. Just then, the office phone rang. It was the private line. Only 3 people had the number: her father, Arthur, and the CEO. Maya looked at the caller ID. It was unknown. She knew who it was. She pressed the speaker button. Sterling's voice filled the room, smooth and oily, completely different from the screaming man in the lobby. He sounded relaxed, almost friendly. He asked Maya how the chair felt. He asked if she had found the little surprise in the accounts yet. He told her that he was a reasonable man. He offered her a deal. He said he could make the debt go away. He had friends at the banks. He could get an extension. All she had to do was reinstate him as CEO, double his salary, and sign a non-disclosure agreement about his previous management style. He told her she had 24 hours to decide. If she refused, the banks would call the loans, the company would die, and she would go down in history as the spoiled brat who destroyed her father's legacy. "Tick-tock, Maya," Sterling said. "Go back to the playground. Let the men handle the business." The line went dead. Maya looked at the phone. For a second, the fear returned. It would be so easy to give in, to let him fix it, to go back to being a normal kid. But then she looked at the picture of her father on the desk. She remembered the janitor Sterling had mocked. She remembered the receptionist he had screamed at. If she let him back in, he wouldn't just steal the money. He would destroy the soul of the company. He would crush those people. No, Maya said. The word was soft, but it hit the heavy silence of the room like a hammer. We don't negotiate with terrorists. Arthur raised an eyebrow. He asked her what the plan was. They had no money to pay the debt. They had no CEO. The stock was tanking. The media was camping outside. Maya walked over to the whiteboard that Sterling had used to track his bonus targets. She picked up an eraser and wiped it clean. She picked up a marker. She wrote one word in the center of the board: truth. She told Arthur to call a press conference. Not a press release. A live press conference in a lobby. Tonight, she told him to invite everyone. The financial bloggers, the major networks, the tabloids. Everyone. She told him to get the files on Project Ether. She told him to call the head of the janitorial union and the representative of the research department. Arthur looked at her, stunned. He warned her that going public with the debt could kill the stock completely. It was suicide. Maya turned to him, her eyes blazing with a fire that was older than her years. She said that Sterling thrived in the shadows. He thrived on secrets and backroom deals. The only way to kill a vampire was to drag it into the sunlight. She wasn't going to hide the death. She was going to own it. She was going to show the world exactly what Sterling had done. And she was going to bet everything, her inheritance, her name, her future, on the one thing Sterling underestimated: the loyalty of the people he had stepped on. He thinks this is a game of chess, Maya said, capping the marker with a sharp click. He thinks he's playing against child, but he's forgotten the most important rule of the game. What's that? Arthur asked. Pawns can kill kings, Maya said. Get the car, Arthur. We have a war to win. As they left the office, the lights of the city seemed to flicker, as if the power grid itself was reacting to the coming storm. Down in the lobby, the crowd of reporters was growing. The sharks were circling, and somewhere in a penthouse across town, Gregor Sterling poured himself a scotch, watching the news ticker, convinced he had already won. He didn't see the little girl coming. He didn't see the tsunami. He only saw the water receding from the shore, and he thought it was a low tide. The night was far from over, and by morning, one of them would be ruined forever. The lobby of the Millennium Tower had transformed into a gladiator arena of flashing lights and shouting reporters. Cables snaked across the marble floor like vipers. Maya stood on a plastic utility crate, the kind used by the cleaning staff to carry supplies, so she could reach the cluster of microphones. It was a deliberate visual choice. She wasn't standing above her people. She was standing on the very foundation of their work. Arthur stood beside her, looking like a weary old lion ready for one last fight. Up in his penthouse, Gregor Sterling leaned forward on his leather sofa, a glass of scotch in hand, watching the live feed on an 80-inch screen. He grinned. He expected a tearful apology. He expected a resignation. He expected the child to crumble under the weight of the cameras. But Maya didn't crumble. She leaned into the microphone, her voice amplified across the plaza outside and into millions of living rooms. She didn't start with excuses. She started with a confession. She looked straight into the lens and admitted that OmniCorp was indeed $400 million in debt. She confirmed that the banks were calling the loans on Friday. The crowd gasped. Stock tickers on the bottom of the news screens turned blood red. In his penthouse, Sterling laughed out loud, toasting the screen. "Game over, little girl," he whispered. "You just dug your own grave." But Maya wasn't finished. She held up a single piece of paper, a printout from the shadow ledger. Her voice hardened, cutting through the murmurs of the press. She stated that while the company was in debt, the money hadn't been lost. It had been moved. She explained that the debt was artificial, manufactured by one man to devalue the company so he could buy its most precious asset for pennies on the dollar. She spoke the name Project Ether. Sterling's smile vanished. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, spilling amber liquid onto a Persian rug. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. How did she know? That file was encrypted. It was buried. On the screen, Maya gestured to a woman stepping out from the crowd of employees behind her. It was Dr. Aris, the head of research and development. Dr. Aris held a prototype in her hands, a small, glowing blue cylinder. Maya explained that this was the Blue Lung, a water purification technology that could save millions of lives in developing countries. It was the patent Sterling had secretly transferred to his own shell company. He hadn't just tried to bankrupt the firm. He had tried to steal the cure for thirst. The narrative shifted instantly. The reporters weren't looking at a failing child CEO anymore. They were looking at a crime scene. Maya announced that she had already forwarded the evidence to the SEC and the district attorney. She declared that OmniCorp would not be merging. Instead, they would be suing Gregor Sterling for corporate espionage, embezzlement, and fraud. Then, she did something Sterling never calculated. She appealed to the creditors directly through the camera. She told the banks that if they foreclosed on Friday, they would get a liquidated shell. But if they gave her 6 months, the Blue Lung would go to market, and they would be paid back triple. She bet her entire personal inheritance, every cent her father left her, as collateral. It was a move of staggering bravery. A silence fell over the crowd, followed by a slow, rising roar of approval. It started with the janitors in the back, banging their mops on the floor. Then the researchers clapped. Then the reporters. Even the cynical financial analysts on the TV commentary began to nod. The stock price stopped falling. It held. Then, slowly began to tick upward. Sterling stared at the TV, hyperventilating. His phone rang. It wasn't his lawyer. It was his offshore banker in the Caymans. The voice on the other end was icy. The accounts had been frozen. Interpol had flagged the transfers. Sterling wasn't just fired. He was broke. He ran to his wall safe, the one hidden behind the painting, intending to grab his emergency cash and passport. He spun the dial, threw open the door, and froze. The safe was empty. Inside, there was only a single folded piece of lined notebook paper. Sterling unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a note, written in a child's neat cursive handwriting. It read, "The service elevator is in the basement. I hope you know the way." He realized then that Arthur must have cleared the safe hours ago, before they even went to the lobby. He was trapped. Sirens began to wail in the distance, getting louder, converging on his building. Maya hadn't just beaten him at his own game. She had flipped the board and locked him in the room. Back in the lobby, Maya stepped down from the crate. Her legs felt like jelly, but she didn't fall. Arthur caught her, a look of fierce pride on his face. The reporters were shouting questions, but they weren't hostile anymore. They were asking, "What's next? And when does the product launch?" Maya looked past the lights, past the cameras, to the bench where she had sat just this morning, treated like trash. She saw the receptionist smiling at her through tears. She saw the security guard who had almost thrown her out, now standing at attention, saluting her. She whispered to Arthur that she wanted to go home. She was done with being a symbol for the day. She just wanted to be a kid again, even if only for a few hours. But as they turned to leave, the heavy glass doors of the entrance burst open. It wasn't the police. It wasn't Sterling. It was a courier from the global bank. He was out of breath, holding a tablet. He pushed through the press line, shouting that he had an urgent message for the chairwoman. The room went quiet. Had the gamble failed? Had the banks called a loan anyway? Maya took the tablet. She read the message. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile she had worn since her father died. She turned the screen to Arthur. The message read, "Loan extension granted. Interest waived. Send us the prospectus for the blue lung. We want to be the lead investors." Maya looked up at the ceiling, imagining her father looking down through the layers of steel and concrete. She hadn't just saved the company, she had saved his soul. But as the cheers erupted around her, she knew one final piece of business remained. Sterling was cornered, but a cornered rat is the most dangerous kind. The flashing lights of the police cruisers reflected off the glass facade of the Millennium Tower, turning the lobby into a kaleidoscope of red and blue. Gregor Sterling didn't come down the service elevator this time. The authorities brought him down the main lift, right through the center of the atrium he used to rule like a tyrant. He was still wearing his pajamas, silk, imported, and now ridiculous. His hands were cuffed behind his back, and a coat was thrown hastily over his shoulders to hide the shame, but it slipped as he was guided through the revolving doors. The press, sensing the final act of the tragedy, surged forward. The man who had been obsessed with his image was now nothing more than a headline on the police scanner. Maya stood by the reception desk, watching him go. She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. There was no joy in seeing a man destroyed, even a bad man. There was only the heavy, solemn realization that actions have consequences. As Sterling was pushed into the back of a squad car, he locked eyes with her through the glass. For a fleeting second, the arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting confusion. He still didn't understand how he had lost to a child. He still didn't understand that he hadn't lost to her age. He had lost to her character. The car drove away, disappearing into the night traffic of the city. The reporters began to pack up their gear. The show was over, but for OmniCorp, the real work was just beginning. In the months that followed, the culture of the company transformed. It didn't happen overnight. Trust is built in drops and lost in buckets, as Arthur liked to say. But under Maya's guidance, and with Arthur acting as a regent and mentor, the toxicity that Sterling had cultivated began to evaporate. The Blue Lung project went into mass production 6 months later. It wasn't sold to the highest bidder. It was distributed at cost to municipalities in drought-stricken areas. The stock price didn't skyrocket like a rocket ship. It grew like a tree, slow, steady, and rooted in something real. The analysts called it a miracle turnaround. Maya just called it doing the job. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the confrontation, the lobby of the Millennium Tower looked much the same as it always had. Marble floors, high ceilings, the hum of commerce. But the atmosphere was different. People smiled. The security guards greeted the staff by name. And near the reception desk, the old bench was still there. Maya walked into the building. She was 13 now, a little taller, carrying a backpack that was slightly less battered. She wasn't wearing a power suit. She was wearing her school uniform. She had just come from a math test. As she walked toward the elevators, she saw a young man standing nervously by the desk. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit, clutching a resume, looking terrified. He looked like he didn't belong. He looked like he was ready to bolt for the door. Maya stopped. She saw the receptionist about to wave him away, probably to tell him that HR was on the 3rd floor and he needed an appointment. Maya stepped in. She walked over to the young man. He looked down at her, confused, seeing just a kid with a backpack. "Hi," Maya said, extending her hand. "I'm Maya. Are you here for an interview?" The young man nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, but I think I'm in the wrong place. I don't really fit the look here." Maya smiled. It was the smile of someone who owns the building, not because she bought it, but because she earned it. "There is no look here anymore," she said. "Just talent. Come with me. I'll show you the way up. You don't want to use the service elevator." She swiped her badge, the one that simply said Maya King, chairwoman, and held the executive elevator open for him. As the doors closed, lifting them toward the sky, The camera pans back to the lobby floor. The sunlight streams in, illuminating the spot where Sterling once stood, now empty. The story of the janitor's kid who became a queen wasn't just about revenge. It was a reminder to the world that power doesn't come from a suit, a watch, or a title. True power is the ability to see value where others see nothing. Gregor Sterling looked at a seed and saw dirt. Maya looked at the same seed and saw forest. And in the end, the forest reclaimed the tower.